I'm not the kind of person who just wants to capture a few inches or a few sort of a small domain. I wake up. I wake up every morning thinking about how can we win? How can we really turn the tables here and change the direction of society meaningfully? And our enemies control almost every institution in society in many ways. Mm-hmm. So what should be our better friend than disruptive technology, than something that offers the path to actually reshuffle the deck in a meaningful way and change the cards? In a sense, in a world where they control so much, conventional means just feel like an uphill battle that you're never going. It's going to be an absolute grind, and at best you're going to capture a little bit. And I feel like that's been the conservative movement for a while. Whereas if we are able to embrace leverage, if we recognize that we have our finger on something that's a trend that matters, and you combine that with the tools of leverage and technology and finance, you can potentially achieve massive outsized results very quickly.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I'm the co-founder and COO of American Moment, and I'm joined by, as always, a wonderful guest this week. But before I get to that, I wanted to make sure to highlight a range of very exciting things that you can find on our website at americanmoment.org. You can find information about our programming, from the Fellowship for American Statecraft to Foundations of American Statecraft to AM Fridays or Frontiers of American Statecraft. We have so many programs going on right now. Things are kind of hectic around here, but make sure that if you're looking to learn more about us, what we do, that you go and check those programs out. We also have AmCanon, which is our resource that Jake so kindly puts together every week, is always adding new pieces about the things that we've read that have informed our views, or probably more accurately radicalized us. So make sure to go check that out. Give it the attention it deserves. And I'm sure you'll find some various things that will interest you there. So this week, I was very lucky to have Nate Fischer of New Founding in the studio. Nate's been a great friend of mine and of American Moment for a very long time. This is actually the third time we've tried to, just our schedules were always conflicting. We were never able to get him down in the chair. So very happy to be able to do this episode. It was great. It was a bit of a departure from, the kinds of things that we normally talk about on this show, very in the weeds, in-depth policy, how the ideas that we have are going to change the world, et cetera, et cetera. We really focused this week on the world of business and venture capital. We talked about exciting things like, what are the kinds of businesses that conservatives can start? How can we win? What does a positive vision for winning for conservatives in the business world look like? What kinds of mistakes have venture funds made in the past that created the conglomerates that we're dominated by now? Very fascinating discussion. I always feel like I learn a lot when I spend time with Nate, and all the guys at New Founding are fantastic. I love them. They also actually have a great podcast. I think it's just called the New Founding Podcast, where they interview founders and that sort of thing. You should go check it out. One of my favorite podcasts. Love to listen to it. Nate Fischer is the chairman and co-founder of New Founding, a co-founder of American Reformer, and an investor and entrepreneur. He makes early-stage venture investments and is the principal of NF Macro, a multi-strategy investment firm. He previously co-founded Trustwork, an online platform for property maintenance services, and InvestRes, a $1.5 billion real estate investment company. We will go now to Nate Fischer. Nate, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, you know how we like to start the show. Who is Nate Fischer? How did you get where you are today? Tell us about everything that you're doing.
So, some background, and then I think a little bit how I approach the world. I grew up upstate New York. I was homeschooled. So I'm 38 years old. I was homeschooled all 12 years, which was not usual at that time. It was not yet a very common thing. It was definitely not usual in New York. We had Mike Ferris's picture on our fridge for the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, in case case the cops were at the door trying to take us away for truancy. So, but it was a really wonderful upbringing. So it was a very independent approach to education that my mom used, and I think really taught us to. I think taught us to think independently about things, sort of practiced it. She was willing to do something that was very independent and countercultural at the time. It was a Christian upbringing. It was one that really shaped. It was not. I would say my parents weren't as political, but they were definitely conservative Christians in how they believed and how they practiced. I grew up interested in politics, business, and technology and software, and I programmed and invested and started businesses and was really interested in politics. Went to college thinking I would go into politics, and that was really my passion as I was getting to college. Probably politics, maybe law of some sort. Spent a summer in D.C., and in that summer, I became convinced, and I think it was potentially an intentional. It may not have been intentional from the program. It was a program called the Fund for American Studies. I became convinced that politics, DC politics at the time, was a place where Mitt Romney-style careerists rose and climbed the ranks, and basically anyone with non-consensus ideas was shunted to the side and going to be irrelevant. So I immediately shifted my mindset. I don't even recall giving it much thought. It was sort of obviously not a path I was interested in. And I just immediately decided I'm going to go into business, investing. If you have a non-consensus view and you're right, you can make a lot of money. And so for me, I was always drawn to what is the non-consensus but important and true viewpoint. I think that sums up a lot of how I look at things. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that there's opportunities like that. And that led me. I decided to go to law school as a path into investing. Went to law school. I graduated, went into real estate, distressed real estate in Florida and Texas for about 3 years, buying apartments, really benefiting from those red to blue state or blue to red state migration trends.
And around what time?
This was 2011. So yeah, so went into so graduated into one of the best distressing investing environments of the era, and I partnered with a classmate and started very, very aggressively buying apartments. So really got to go straight into what I saw as the opportunity. Met my wife at HLS, and we got married a few years in, and so did that business, but it was never going to be a career for me. Like those threads still resonated. I was still interested in politics, and it was really in the Trump era that I realized that my thesis about politics was no longer true. Politics was no longer a place where the Mitt Romney types were climbing, and non-consensus ideas were getting you dismissed. Now Trump was driving this ideas-driven paradigm shift where the non-consensus view was changing the movement, and the Mitt Romneys were being shunted to the side. And I simultaneously saw that coming together in Silicon Valley. I was in Silicon Valley at that time, and saw the technology world really embracing politics across all of their narratives. I mean, you think of Facebook's mission at the time: make the world a more open and connected place. That is a political vision. I saw sort of pervasive, you could say sort of a bull market in politics. Everything was growing political, and politics were growing more and more important, and not just the narrow fake politics of the Romney Bush era, but real political questions about the country. And that drew me to the question of here is a paradigm shift happening. Here's something that touches a number of things that I've been focused on for my life. Here's the opportunity to have asymmetric impact, and that really, in many ways, that sums up. It's sort of where is that opportunity to really move the needle in an important way.
Yeah, and so what do you tell us more about the organization that you're running now?
Yep. So I approached it. So it's a company called New Founding. It's a venture firm for the American right. It's a firm where we will invest in companies. We'll back mostly at this stage. We'll be investing in through a fund that we launched just a few months ago. We launched a fund to invest in pre-seed and seed, which would be early stage companies where there is a clear nexus between the political and cultural trends that we're seeing, specifically those on the right, and some sort of outsized business opportunity.
Yeah.
So it's a great example. We're leading the round, the pre-seed round, the first round for a pro-life health insurance company. It's a company that is in a space that has become a major problem in many, many areas of society. It's become deeply politicized. It's a space that people have become very politically aware. A number of people have switched their doctors over. COVID, for instance, is enormous. And this is going to start by creating a product that explicitly appeals to people on the right. Specifically, the founders are Catholic, and they're going to fit all the sort of criteria for Catholic ethics with what they do and don't cover. But it also, I think, it's also just very, very innovative founders. They have been at some of the most innovative health insurance startups. They know what they're doing. They know the problems in the industry. And I think you'll have a cutting edge product that is in a space where I think health insurance is sort of a natural point of organization, to serve as that integration layer to help reshape the entire healthcare space. They could build an entire new network of doctors who don't require COVID vaccines, for instance, or aren't going to trans your kid. And so I think it's a good illustration. I sort of dove into the details, but I think it's a good illustration of how we approach this, which is I'm looking for through the private sector, where in some sense, I think there's often less structural impediments than you face in conventional politics in DC, the opportunity to play, to push a lever that could actually meaningfully reshape something with great political importance to Americans, and really help drive asymmetric change in the country that way.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into that because I think a lot of people, particularly in our kind of faction of the conservative movement, are inherently skeptical of people in finance, like the finance industry. You know, they see kind of this economic shift that we've gone through over the last couple decades and kind of lay it at the feet of all these, you know, fund managers and that sort of thing, and say, well, we prioritized, you know, line going up, and, you know, what did we get for it? So why is what you're doing different, and why does it matter?
Well, I would look at finance I would look at both finance and technology. I think what you said is absolutely true of technology as well. I would look at both finance and technology as levers. They give you leverage. They give you power to do something. They are, and as I pointed to earlier, they have become important domains for, in a sense, creating the future. I would say the flaw in the conservative movement, the classic sort of post-war conservative movement, is it's focused on, it reduces down to conserving good things without focusing on a true positive alternative vision for the future. So yes, it's natural that they're suspicious of both finance and technology, especially technology. Technology is going to inherently chip away at good things that exist in the past, and is going to essentially guarantee that conservatism loses. A few great thinkers have made this point. John Askonas made this point. I think Ted Kaczynski made this point. But the problem, I think, is that if that's if that's all you have as your political vision is conserving good things, you're going to lose, because you're not going to stop technology. Yeah. I don't believe that we need to limit it to that. I'm a Christian, so I think that I think that we have a dominion mandate to fill the earth, to subdue it, to take dominion, and I think that involves a very strong positive vision for what we should be imagining for the world. And as a movement, I think we need to really develop out an alternative positive vision that we can be competing for, rather than simply just trying to say no to the left's positive vision. So that leads to then the question of how to implement that. And if we have a positive vision that we're offering, first off, if we've seeded that space, if we haven't had that, it's natural that those who are looking for leverage, who are looking to achieve things, sort of default to a progressive vision in many cases. So in many cases, I think a lot of people in finance and technology truly are, they have a true belief in some sort of lefty vision. But for many of them, it's just, they want to build something. They're ambitious people. They're builders. They're only being offered a vision by one side that allows them to embrace that creative potential. We should be offering an alternative. If we offer an alternative, I think we will draw a lot of people who are not satisfied with that. And then secondly, it's going to happen anyway. It's going to happen, and we should be players in that space, and that's kind of the key. And then lastly, and this goes to disruptive technology, so I'm expanding a little bit on the finance, but our enemies control almost every institution in society in many ways. Mm-hmm. So what should be our better friend than disruptive technology, than something that offers the path to actually reshuffle the deck in a meaningful way and change the cards? In a sense, in a world where they control so much, conventional means just feel like an uphill battle that you're never going. It's going to be an absolute grind, and at best you're going to capture a little bit. And I feel like that's been the conservative movement for a while. Whereas if we are able to embrace leverage, if we recognize that we have our finger on something that's a trend that matters, and you combine that with the tools of leverage and technology and finance, you can potentially achieve massive outsized results very quickly.
Yeah, I think that this is very interesting. I think that you're right. That basically every institution, from business to government bureaucracies, these big technology companies, are almost exclusively owned by the left. And it seems like what you're doing is kind of a David versus Goliath situation. How does something like new founding scale? How do you get, other people together to do the kinds of similar things that you're doing, and then on the business side as well?
So it's absolutely right that in this space, as in many other spaces, the dominant players tend to be on the left. And this is something that really goes to, I think it goes to my psyche in some ways, the question of how do we do that? Because I don't really I don't feel like I personally, you ask who I am, I'm not the kind of person who just wants to capture a few inches or a few sort of a small domain. I wake up, I wake up every morning thinking about how can we win? How can we really turn the tables here and change the direction of society meaningfully? And I think it requires a lot of creativity. In many ways, you look at great disruptive things and they are creative. They are creative, and it's creativity applied to particular problems. But I think the nature of technology is it does chip away at the status quo. It actually does offer the possibility of disrupting something that is an incumbent power and replacing it with something potentially far more powerful. You think of how Yahoo was the dominant search engine in a sense. It was sort of the preeminent one, Yahoo, AOL, all of those. Google comes in and it just totally disrupts those. Google's going to be disrupted. I think very high probability Google's going to be disrupted even in the next 2 to 3 decades, or it's not going to be the preeminent power that it is today. Who's going to control that? Mm-hmm. It could be us. And I actually think not only could it be us, but I think we have some important advantages. And you think of the nature of dissident movements, and you think of the nature of what it takes to get new and disruptive technologies off the ground. And what we need to do is we need to think, what are we know our disadvantages. We have tremendous disadvantages. What are our advantages here? And the advantage is when you have a new disruptive technology, I think there's two. One is we understand, we don't believe that we just have different values than the left. I think traditionally conservatives liked to sort of look at the world the same way, and then they would just say, well, we believe abortion's bad, they believe abortion's good, whatever. No, I actually think we look at the world differently. We have a different vision of the world. I think COVID highlighted this actually more than many things. We have a different vision of reality, and I believe we're right. And if you're right about important truths about the world, that is something that if you're competing in business, if you're competing in any domain, you should be willing to make bets on your beliefs. And if you're right, you should win you could potentially win in very high stakes ways. So we have a correct understanding of human nature. I believe they have a flawed understanding of human nature. Many new and disruptive technologies are going to be deeply shaped by your views about human nature. I think Facebook's sort of failure to achieve many of its sort of dreams of a more open and connected world reflected the fact that they had naively idealistic views of what their technology would do. Silicon Valley has failed to create trust in any meaningful way. They failed to really mediate trust. Their networks are very consumeristic rather than trust driven. And I think that reflects the fact that they don't understand the sort of richer side of human relationships and of human community. And so they've failed to build tools that facilitate that. Then I think maybe the biggest advantage we face is when you build something new, so let's say you have a new disruptive technology, let's say it's sort of a clearly superior starting point in terms of paradigm. Who are going to be the early adopters? That's always a significant challenge. You have incumbents, and it's usually very comfortable to stay with the incumbents. Early adoption is risky. Early adoption is often an inferior product in many ways. It's an inferior experience on the whole, even if an aspect is superior. Who's going to be a natural early adopter but people who are profoundly dissatisfied with the status quo? And I think that's often going to be dissidents and Christians, particularly strong, solid little dissident Christian communities. You've talked about Moscow, Idaho. That's a great example. Like, you could potentially get an entire community like that to get over to a new technology, and you're going to have an entire network effect very quickly, and you can then build from there. And that's how America was built, in a sense. The first, you had sort of the pioneers, the individualists, the libertarians, so to speak, the sort of people who are in crypto now. But the first communities to really move as communities and gain that dominant network effect here, and in many ways predominantly shape the culture of the new world, were deeply religious, profoundly dissatisfied communities that had a sort of insularity that drove them to move together. And if we recognize that propensity and recognize what new technologies are at that point where they're ready for that sort of early community adoption, and we help shepherd that, and we make sure that the companies that are now controlling that technology are in the hands of our people, then there's a very clear path to our side controlling the next Google.
So what does conservatives winning in the economy look like, very practically speaking?
I'll use technology a little bit more directly, but I think they're so integrally related. Let's say we had, well, first I'll use the health insurance example, just because that's one that we're already talking about here. That one means that and that's tough because there's government regulation, so there'll be limits on what you can achieve. But one where what is covered and what is valued is going to reflect our view of what's good, our view of what's appropriate. The type of doctors, the networks of doctors, the incentives in the system all point in a direction that is consistent with our values. It's not a system that necessarily pushes stuff that we don't trust, that we have good reason not to trust on us. And obviously there's a lot of government component there. There's a lot of private sector, but to the extent the health insurer plays a role in this, they're not pushing you or incentivizing you to go get some sort of medical intervention that we would be skeptical of. First off, I think just there's a epistemological suspicion that we as conservatives would have of a sort of technocratic conceit that we can evaluate the world with a great deal of confidence based on, let's say, limited scientific analysis. So I think that there's an epistemological humility that I think is inherent in conservatism, and that would be applied to how we think about treatment. That would be applied to how we think about coverage and incentives. Getting into, I think, probably a more powerful example and going to the disruptive technology. Imagine we had a Google alternative. Increasingly, more and more of your decisions online and off are mediated by digital algorithms. So where you go to eat, maybe yes, maybe no, but for a lot of times where I go to eat is in many ways mediated by Yelp, mediated by Google. I type in lunch in Google and it recommends places. I look at the rating system, and there are values laden in all of those algorithmic recommendations. It's actually inherent. You think of an algorithmic recommendation, you think of the Google search result. You type something in the Google search result, there's a number 1 result, there's a number 2 result, number 10, number 100, so on. There must be a value system that determines why 1 is ahead of 2. It cannot be neutral. And I think it's an important point that supports sort of the new right trend over the old right. The old right likes a sort of procedural neutrality. They often even talk, I think they talk about this ideal of public neutrality. Well, if more and more of life is now mediated by, in many cases, monopoly platforms that are inherently value laden, you can't have neutrality. And the left knows this. You saw the left pushing AI algorithmic justice or some sort of whatever euphemism they came up with, going back to after the 2016 election, and they realized that it wasn't neutral, it was actually rewarding engagement. Neutral is not going to get them what they want. And so they need to catechize the bots, to use a term that a colleague, James Poulos, has used. They need to catechize the bots with their religion, their woke religion that de-emphasizes hate or whatever they would say. Well, I think we do the same. We should catechize the bots of the digital platforms that are going to mediate more and more of life with a value system that truly elevates the good. Elevates the good, the true, and the beautiful. And there's all sorts of contexts where, I mean, imagine you go to a search engine, you type something, and let's say you type in kids' books in the search engine, and it actually elevates good content in kids' books. You go to Google now, you type that in, it's probably going to elevate something.
Anti-racist baby.
Yeah, at best. It might be transing your kid for all you know, subtly. So it's going to elevate all sorts of horrible things, but or it's just going to be neutral, and it's going to essentially, the algorithm will try to stay neutral, but it'll essentially elevate those sort of credentialed elites, credentialed authorities in other places that are probably catechized with a particular value set. We could catechize that algorithm to actually elevate, recognize it's not just relevance or hits or something, but it's actually some definition of the good that people are looking for when they type a result in. And that increasingly Google's doing that, but not in a way that reflects our values.
Yeah, they're doing it with like LGBTQ plus friendly or whatever.
Disinformation is a huge one. They define disinformation in ways that are very slanted.
Yeah, the thread about a Google alternative is very, very interesting to me. This is something that I've been pretty critical of in the past. This idea that we basically need to just create right-leaning, or actually I think in many cases neutral. A lot of people kind of default back to this. Well, we just need something that's unbiased. This has been kind of a refrain of a lot of folks in the business world think we just need to go back to the way they interpret the way business was in the 80s and 90s. How do you think about building an alternative economy as it relates to creating, products that may exist already in some form, but is slanted in the opposite direction versus entirely new products that people have not yet conceived of?
So my interest by far goes to the latter. As I said, I wake up and I think about how we can win. And you're almost never going to win a category by just creating a copycat of it. I mean, creating a sort of conservative Amazon, for instance, that's first of all, that's the last company in the world that I would want to compete with. A lot of what they do is very, very hard to do well. And so if you just try to create a sort of copy, you're maybe going to pick off a sort of niche market share. You need to strive to do better. We should strive to do better. And first off, we recognize that wokeness, DEI, all of that is increasingly going to degrade the incumbent companies in a way that is going to create vulnerabilities. But secondly, I think going to the Google example, like how do you beat, from a thought experiment, how do you beat Google? Not just how do you have your conservative alternative to Google, but how do you beat Google? You have to offer a better product. You have to offer a product that the vast majority of people are going to find better and more useful, or at least a large share of the people in situations that matter are going to find better and more useful. And maybe it's not a direct one-to-one analog, but think about their vulnerabilities. So, because just going back to the previous one, if you just try to copy a company, first of all, you're just not even going to get as good as they are. You're going to be almost guaranteeing inferiority on things, and you're going to have the sort of niche audience that you're aiming for with values. That's going to be reduced by the fact that there's already inertia keeping people from moving. Then you're going to have often an inferior product, so that's going to reduce your market even more. And it's only a sort of a minority of the country that even cares that much about politics in these decisions, period. So it sort of guarantees that you're at best going to be sort of a tiny niche market. Now that can be great in certain cases. I actually think for something, for a lot of categories, that's like kids content. That's still valuable. It still provides an incredibly valuable service to our people. It is actually a better product, even if it might be seen as subjective in many ways. It's actually a meaningfully better product for the people who are buying them. So I've absolutely no problem with that type of business. And I think it can be a good way to make good money with relatively low risk. It's kind of like you have the market, you know who the market is going to be. You just got to go essentially execute and give them what they want. And you're not trying to take any technological risk. You're not trying to do anything super innovative, which means it's less risky from a business standpoint, but you're immediately creating value.
Yeah, it's just better content.
Yeah, better content. Sometimes sometimes it might just be a straight up sort of values. You could imagine something that's a very similar product, but its advertisements just don't offend you. And that's worth something. And that advertising is something that reinforces cultural values. So I'm not going to dismiss that, but that's not going to turn the tide. Whereas the Google one is, and getting to kind of a couple of ways that we would have an advantage. I already got to the point of early adopters and how we could get early adopters to a potentially superior solution. But then the question becomes, what would a potentially superior solution look like? And I think I would say that recognition of the good, of the algorithm that actually elevates the good, that is so core to Google's business that our ability to think clearly about those questions actually allows us to produce a vastly superior product. So if you think about Google, they come from a technocratic mindset. In many ways, I would say they don't know how to define the good. They don't even know how to think about the good. They don't know what that means. They don't have the epistemological foundation to distinguish spam from non-spam. And theoretically, that should be the entire purpose of a search engine, should be able to distinguish what is worth seeing. And so if you can't define man and woman, then there's going to be a lot of problems with ranking information and providing information. And that's going to lead to very muddled thinking, and it's going to lead to their inability to actually deliver just practical value to a lot of people who still seek that. And that's a vulnerability that I think it's a vulnerability that goes to the core of their utility. And they can kind of punt on that. They can kind of go to get you the results that you want, that you find useful, which I think they'll do, which is very subjective. But that's not going to be as good of a product as a product that can actually get you something more than you already know that you want. They can get you something that is that you go there and you actually get sort of surprised by the informative results. So I think that's a key vulnerability, and I'm using Google, but that applies to almost all the content out there. I mean, it's almost like it's sort of notable that Facebook is moving its feed in a direction that's more purely algorithmic, like TikTok. It's like everything is converging toward this TikTok model where they can reward engagement and it's algorithmically driven, but they have very little sense of any sort of higher value they're providing. Mm-hmm. And that gets to what is a higher value. There's the good, and then I think trust. I touched on trust earlier. You think of the value of networks, and the value of networks come from both their size, but they also come from the value of the connections, the significance and importance of connections that are made within those networks. And you think of like your participation in the Facebook network. That is not a valuable network. Its market cap is approximately, I don't know the exact number, but let's say it's $300 billion, and it has 1.5 billion daily average users. That's a market value of $200 per user per network, which is just not a big share of your, and that's not a market cap. It's more than the annual value. The annual value is a fraction of that. That's a tiny fraction of your life that is, if you even use Facebook, that is sort of attributed to value in that network. Contrast that with, let's say, a church or a country club that you're deeply invested in. Like that is a network where, because of the bonds that are built there, because of sort of the rich strength of the trust, it's the kind of place where a recommendation can get you a job. It's the kind of place that could result in you can do very high value interactions that come out of that network. And yes, it's small, and a lot of times those don't scale as well, but they can scale a lot more than I think many people assume. And historically, in many cases, high trust communities, high trust networks have often scaled to tens, hundreds of thousands of people in important ways. Ways that are just totally absent from the digital world today. Example I give is often certain immigrant communities where even at the hundreds of thousands, you go at 16, let's say, you go work for someone who's a businessman there. You do a good job for a few years, you impress him, and his recommendation then gets you access to capital, it gets you access to opportunity, essentially a sort of alternative credentialing system to the primary sort of bureaucratic university-driven one. If that type of value, the mediation of trust comes online, I think something like that could very, very quickly, even at a relatively moderate scale, even at the scale of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, be a far more powerful that kind of value compounds very quickly and gets rich. That could be a far more powerful network than even the biggest digital networks today.
Yeah. It strikes me that in many industries, you either have a monopoly at the top or, so like you mentioned Amazon as an example. That's a good example of that, right? Like they've basically got, shopping online and shipping down on lock. And then you have other industries like, let's even just say the coffee business, right? Where it's like an amalgamation of several companies, and you have things like Black Rifle Coffee as an example, right? Like we're trying to make something that's more, they say conservative, I would say values neutral, but looking at something like that and seeing, that doesn't really work. What are some industries? Basically, my point is that these are kind of, I think a lot of industries are like that.
Yep.
So what are some of the industries out there, aside, you've obviously mentioned healthcare, that are ripe for disruption?
So that's a good question. And part of it is it's something that I think I have to remain opportunistic. I mean, I think Google is actually ripe for disruption. And going to the monopoly, one way you can think of a monopoly, especially in a digital age, a monopoly that mediates your life, is it's almost like a layer of government. I think of the different domains, and you can think of sort of the digital domain, federal domain, the state domain, local level. The domains that I know will matter will be the local and the digital. I actually have less of a theory of, let's say, how significant the federal government will be in 30, 50 years. It may or may not remain a primary layer of organization, but we know the digital layer will matter, and the monopolies that control the digital layer, and there's a lot of natural network monopolies there. Effectively, there's going to be a monopoly. It will be playing a significant role in potentially mediating decisions throughout all layers of your life. That's effectively a government. And that goes to the question of the good, right? It should be governed for the common good. Right now, as I look at the current network monopolies, I would say they are all vulnerable because none of them are acting like, except maybe Amazon. Amazon is actually pretty effective. If you think of sort of the legitimacy that comes from effectiveness, Amazon does some very hard things like gets you packages overnight. That's hard to compete with. That's a sort of legitimacy. But although I think its product recommendation and some of that stuff is flawed, and that's actually a much more values laden thing. So that's a more important one. I think all of those are vulnerable. I think that across different aspects, probably less SaaS actually. I mean, SaaS is one where so Salesforce, things like that. It is sort of a natural monopoly. It is a serious threat. I think you'll have people choose alternatives that they can trust, that are values aligned. And after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and you had all these tech companies essentially deplatform Russia as a country, I think you'll have a lot of countries recognize that their sovereignty is at stake if they depend on American tech companies, American SaaS companies. So you will see a drive for alternatives. I don't know that that'll look like disruption per se, though. I think in many cases that'll just be a sort of parallel alternative, maybe an open source alternative or something. Whereas I think the big tech networks, particularly the ones whose product is values driven, are ripe for disruption. I would say areas that interest us, a lot of the crypto related technology, the sort of decentralized technology that interests me because it is in many ways, I think some level of decentralized is a superior model in that it doesn't require you to trust a centralized party to the same degree. And we're in a world where there's sort of a systematic decline of trust. You're seeing the sort of steady decline of institutional trust and societal trust. And in a world where divisions are growing and where trust is lacking, you are going to see more and more people seek an alternative that doesn't require trusting someone who could be politically hostile to you, doesn't require trusting someone who could be ordered to shut you down by a court that's politically hostile to you, even if they don't want to be political. So I think that aspect of not just having the company aligned with you, but actually tying their own hands technologically in the way they architect the software is going to be in a more and more sort of chaotic and divided and even more and more sort of chaotic and divided world, that is going to be a winning formula in important ways if they can combine good user experience with a degree of digital sovereignty.
Yeah. So I'm curious, just throw out an example. Like, let's say consumer goods, generally speaking. So things like groceries, stuff for your house, things you can buy at Walmart. Is that something like, it strikes me as, we don't do a lot of manufacturing of those goods in the United States anyway. Like, what do you think about something like that?
So it's a tough space, and it's a tough space precisely because you're competing with China in many cases. I would say there's going to be a lot of change in that space, and you're probably going to end up seeing more reshoring or more nearshoring. And I think you can come up with different reasons for that. Actually, a concept we're working on is the idea of it would be an investment consultant to promulgate a doctrine that would be an alternative to ESG. And the doctrine that I'm working on is one that fundamentally recognizes that distance of any sort is a risk factor that is probably a risk factor that is neglected by current financial models. So if you have a company that has a long supply chain, if it has a lot of operational leverage in various ways, that should be something that should require you to demand a higher equity return, a higher equity cost of capital.
So not just China, but like also India, as an example.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think distance, and I would say distance, I would also say sort of levels of political divide and things. So there's a lot of different ways you can look, but certainly, yes, India would also be a risk. I mean, anywhere that is anything that adds a layer of unpredictability should be priced in. And I think if we have a systematic recognition, which you already recognize with financial leverage, right? So you add leverage to a company, you add debt to a company, and the required equity return goes up in all of the models. But you add operational leverage, which can be a lot of things. It can be just-in-time supply chains. It can be outsourcing production to another country. All of those things also create risk. And in a world of greater and greater global disruptions, you are going to see more and more risk. So I would say it's not that you're necessarily going to see a sort of disruption of those so much as you're going to see a sort of structural incentive pushing toward models that have less risk there. And that's going to be that'll be a gradual process. Now, consumer goods, I think there's also the values thing that is very significant. They have advertisements. Advertisements don't just inform you about the product, but they create demand. They essentially sell you on an aspirational vision of life. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're seeing a sharp divide there, where essentially the left is pushing a vision of life that is fundamentally different than the one that excuse my left hand. The left is pushing a vision of life that's fundamentally different than the one that the right has to offer, and in many ways a very unattractive vision of life. I mean, it is literally ugly. The picture of life that they show you, and you go to a lot of cities and you see the sort of degradation of the cities. You see the people, the way that they dress, all of that is something where they've just embraced, they've dismissed beauty. So I think you'll see alternatives that actually they have beauty in their ads that is going to appeal to a group of people who are not attracted to what the left offers in ads. You're going to have products that are consistent with that. We have a product, it's called Kindred Harvest, and its first product is tea. They're also adding honey and certain other things where it's really natural, organic, sort of industrial pollutant free, glue free, heavy metal free, plastic free, all of that stuff with the tea bags and all that very high end stuff. That sort of health and wellness lifestyle, being aware of a product that doesn't have a lot of industrial pollutants, that is something that the right is increasingly demanding, and they're at the forefront of demanding. I certainly think that there will be an early adopter base on the right that's drawn to things like that. I think you'll see I suspect you'll see a broader shift toward that model, that approach to things across sort of the middle. So you could think of that as sort of a disruptive force toward consumer products that reflect a different set of priorities and a different vision in life.
Yeah. So something I'm thinking about here is, the amount of people that are going to realign their decisions based on not necessarily, the wokeness of a given company or whatever, but legitimately just because they want better stuff. Like stuff that's actually just better made, like not cheap Chinese crap, or they're in the service-based industry in particular, like someone where they can, or a business where they can talk to a person that speaks English.
Yep.
Right. Do you think more decisions are going to be made kind of along that route than the wokeness necessarily?
Yeah, I think that in some sense the sort of political it's hard to say exactly. In the current market, I think there's going to be a group that makes a decision based on politics, but then there will be a broader group that makes a decision because it's just a better product. And using the life insurance or the health insurance company as an example, I think their initial product is a product that is it's non-ACA, it's innovative. It also fits all these Catholic standards. That is going to particularly, and really broadly, broad range of Christians will care about a lot of these things. The first people that I'll resonate with is a subset of people where they hear it exists and they immediately want it. They know that this is a problem. They know that this is a sector that gives them a lot of grief, a lot of angst. They're going to move for a political reason. However, I actually think that this can be a better product in important ways. It's operating in a way where it's just an industry that's incredibly bureaucratic and incredibly sclerotic in many ways in how they approach things. And you have an innovative startup here that is attuned to many of the sort of newer trends in delivery of medicine, things that allow more wellness. Let's say they reduce the overall cost and they incentivize. The incentives are better aligned with a model that produces health rather than delivers healthcare. And that could be a product that is just cost effective in an area that is one of the most concerning and expensive products, one of the biggest financial challenges for a very wide range of people. So you could actually see something where they're at the forefront, and a lot of these legacy systems are just, they have so many incentives, they have so much baked into their current products, it's hard for them to just adjust in a way that ever makes them as competitive.
Yeah.
And that's going to just drive a lot of people care about health. You don't have to be super political to realize this is going to get you what you need at a lower cost. Well,
most people hate their health insurance company too. Between the amount of money that they have to spend and how frustrating it is to deal with them. So a trend that I've noticed recently is this kind of, I can reference the Benedict Option kind of as an example here, where you have a lot of, conservatives, Christians, who really what they want is to just kind of be left alone. Mm-hmm. So they want to, get married, have kids, work a normal job and buy products from people that don't hate them. My guess would be that I think we're seeing less of these people going in and starting new businesses.
Yep.
Do you think, and traditionally that has not been the case, right? It's been conservatives that have, started kind of as we've talked about these big shifts. How do you think we kind of recover that mentality as conservatives?
So, and it's a really good question. I actually don't know if it would be conservatives who have traditionally started. Certainly it's people who might not be associated with the left. In many ways, I think what you describe is sort of a natural instinct of conservatives. Whereas I think many of the great entrepreneurs in our country's history they've been people who are inherently branching out from their community. They're looking for something more. It's a similar drive to sort of the drive for politics in many ways. It's the question of who goes to DC, who does things like that. People want to have impact at a greater scale. I think it's recovering an alternative positive vision. This is again going back to why am I doing venture? One thing I love about venture is perhaps the best. I think it is a domain that is perfectly suited to start to articulate a positive vision here. If we don't yet have a startup in an area that I think should be changed, should be disrupted, we can start to put out thought leadership on it. We can start to put out ideas around what should happen. Here's our understanding of the problem. Here's an opportunity that we see. Here's what a right-wing vision of this space would look like. And that serves as a little bit of a call to action for entrepreneurs, as a call for ideas, as a call for people to think about this, and potentially someone has the skills to go build that. And so it's a great platform to flesh that out. And I think the biggest missing need in our movement is that positive vision. In many ways, I think the new right has tried to do that, but it's a little bit hamstrung by the fact that they're still focused often on a sort of policy and government space. And as much as I reject the Con Inc. limitations of the sort of a dogmatic limitation of government, I think nonetheless, I remain deeply pro-market. I think markets remain the best solution. Most things should be done through the private sector. Doesn't mean that government can't play a role in encouraging that, but the right platform for most aspects of a positive vision will remain something in the private sector. Mm-hmm. And trying to do that through policy, through a vision of policy and government is just going to, I'm even wary, I'll say I'm wary of a lot of the big tech regulatory things that you see coming out of the new right, because there's lots of unintended consequences. It's easy to see how that'll play out in a way that'll just cement power with our enemies. Or I think it's just, it's actually very difficult. It would be, think of the sort of Google for the good. There's almost no way that regulators can actually achieve regulation of the Google algorithm from DC. Whereas I think that in a sense, Google itself is sort of a layer of government, and the entity that disrupts Google is going to arise from the private sector, but it's almost like one regime defeating another regime to take control of a domain that now matters, or now who's taking control of the ocean now in the age of trade. And that you can't sort of come in and outside regulate the algorithm. I think China had the state capacity to do that, but which they largely have there. But I don't think that could happen in America. I think it would be too challenging with our constitutional culture and many things. But I think an entrepreneurial vision of what a different, better, positive value Google looks like is something that absolutely could arise. And so I think being in a place where you're able to develop those thoughts and then push the levers that turn those thoughts into action is at the heart of where it's at the heart of where the problem lies, at the heart of where the opportunity lies in our movement.
What do you think other venture funds have done wrong to get us to where we are now?
I think part of it is many of them have embraced a left-wing ideology. And as going back to the point that venture is sort of an inherently political space, everything in many ways, sort of most aspects of life are inherently political in some sense, sort of in the Aristotelian sense of how do we live together well. Mm-hmm. But venture particularly and startups are by nature, they're envisioning something that doesn't exist and they're building it. They're deciding what to build and they're building it. And especially in a digital network age that has profoundly political implications. I would say most of them have bought into a doctrine, an inherently globalist doctrine here. So the type of technology they're building and they're backing is designed to fundamentally, it's about breaking down natural barriers. It's about using technology to chip away at and to bypass natural sort of barriers. Rather than thinking about how to build, as an example, build technology that strengthens community bonds, that offers tools an example I give that we're working on this problem is, say you had a tool that would allow you, say you want something, you need a recommendation for something. If you could ask for a recommendation in your church, that's great. You might get some good recommendations, but the volume is not there. But what if there were tools that made it easier and easier for you to sort of get more and more out of local and aligned communities that really matter? You could get recommendations from your church and maybe from 10 aligned churches in the area or in the denomination. Things like that you're actually building technology to lever these existing bonds. I would say that's a fundamentally different way of looking at technology, whereas the current venture ones are almost always trying to think, their default solution is almost always sort of inherently individualistic, depersonalized, global in some way.
Yeah.
I would say the other one is they are actively, they're often actively embracing a transhumanism in terms of their values. So they'll embrace whenever possible, sort of technology replacing people rather than technology complementing people. And this actually leads to an important error that they've made that is a great example of how you would earn more money. So I think engineers and economists for 50 years they've sort of viewed brokers as just unnecessary transaction costs waiting to be intermediated, waiting to be disintermediated and replaced. They see them as having very little value. In the engineering mindset, in the technocratic economic mindset, there's not value to this intermediary who's building relationships at the country club or whatever. They failed time and time and time again. They've bet on attempts to disintermediate the brokers, and they've failed. And they've failed because they have a flawed vision of human nature that doesn't recognize the sort of profoundly important role in building trust and brokering trust and all of that brokers actually play. So a better alternative would be one that actually recognizes the significance of things like that and provides tools that provide leverage to the brokers. They augment the broker. Someone has this skill and they allow them to be more productive. Maybe they're helping them replace the sort of bureaucratic busy work so they can do even more of what the core of their job is. But the problem, and this is part of why it gets us here, is if you have a flawed vision, but you have lots of money behind it and you do build something that's innovative in certain ways, it still may serve to move the world in that direction. You try to replace people in a certain capacity. You may well succeed in replacing it. You may get corporations to adopt it and they change their work practices in a way that are technocratically managing or replacing those people. Even if the solution ends up being inferior, the promises don't bear out. You've still moved the world in a direction that is much more sort of technology driven, technology managed, and in many cases actually inferior in output. So it's you've lost the sort of skill or craft that is at the core of I think that is at the core of a well-developed human civilization, and certainly the economic side of that. You've replaced it with something that's inferior or even just not a meaningful step forward in important ways. But you've done so because you put enough resources in the belief there that does tend to drive it. And I think we've seen that. I would say the stagnation in our country today is broadly a result of squeezing the human out of finance, squeezing the human out of business, and replacing it with technocratic processes. The human has the element of surprise. It has the element of innovation, of entrepreneurial creation that in many ways I think channels God's creation of the world in Genesis 1. That's the most fundamentally human thing we do. And our modern system wants to replace any decision that has that surprise, that unpredictability, with something that can be analyzed and proved in spreadsheets. Or maybe they'll trust artificial intelligence, even if it's a little bit more of a black box. Mm-hmm. They'll trust artificial intelligence more than human intelligence. But ultimately, that's, I think, not creative in the same way. And so you end up with a system that has just lost it's lost the life. I mean, I think that the vitality of life includes that human creative element, and we've squeezed the life, often intentionally, based on a transhumanist or technocratic vision. We've squeezed the life out of our economy, squeezed the life out of our society.
Yeah, the second part of that answer is what I'm most interested in. I know it seems like Amazon, Google, Facebook, like these sorts of things run our lives, but you've mentioned several times during the episode that a lot of these industries are kind of ripe for disruption. And so I'm wondering, from an investment strategy perspective, if you were in their shoes, whether you actually think they've made, again, taking the political part out of it, if they've actually made good investments, or if they're about to lose out on a bunch of stuff because we're going to innovate in a way that they're not.
There's certainly, I would clearly, if you've invested in Amazon, you've done very well.
Yeah.
So it's hard to fault them on that. And I would actually say, going to that last point about the life, the creative human investment, I actually think venture capital remains perhaps the one bright spot in the economy where the rest of the economy has actually gone far more technocratic. Venture continues to make sort of bold bets on people. I think they have some flaws in how they approach it, but it remains something where very, very creative, very smart people are thinking about the future in very innovative ways, and they're willing to take a significant bet on that cannot be penciled out the way you can pencil out the returns on an apartment building. So I hold venture in relatively high regard relative to a lot, where I think in so much of the economy, you've gone in the exact opposite direction, where you've gone to an index fund model where it's BlackRock. BlackRock epitomizes bureaucratic allocation of capital. Vast majority of people there are not investors in any meaningful sense. They have no ability to assess a sort of a truly innovative risk. They're doing what computers are doing, or they're even replacing. They're attempting to replace discretion altogether. And that, I think, is, and you actually see that in hiring as well, where in hiring you systematically replace knowing someone, interviewing them, evaluating them, taking a risk on them with, we're going to essentially outsource that to a sort of credentialing system that's just going to rank the person according to some standards. And then we can tweak the rankings if we want more of this type of diversity, because our model says that it's really ideology, but we have a model that says you get this diversity and this is going to result in a better outcome because diversity is our strength, because McKinsey said it in this study or whatever. And it's a technocratic model that's actually perfectly conducive to wokeness. That's where I would say they're really losing. So they really are losing. It can be okay at sort of continuing to earn money from something that has a lot of profit. Although, as you saw with Bud Light, that mindset can lead to catastrophic errors that would not be made by that would not be made by a well-rounded human with good judgment who really understands their market.
Yeah.
But I think even more, they're losing upside and opportunity in that space. So that's where I would say the big errors are. I do think that Silicon Valley has some blind spots that's going to lead them to large amounts of venture money have chased certainly on the social network side, certain types of networks that I think have not really borne out the full promise. And there's a lack of appreciation for where potentially much bigger opportunities are.
Yeah, and that's kind of hitting on what I'm getting at. In maybe as a venture fund guy, you got lucky with Amazon, you got your whale, right? But with how far divorced you are from what human beings actually want, can you ever win again?
What's interesting is you do often see a number of venture capitalists who are sort of one-hit wonders. They nail something that's outside the box like that. They often build a successful practice because then you can recruit, you can get a lot of capital, and you can then get the hotter founders at certain stages. They come to you. You're a prestigious venture capitalist, but they don't nail the next big thing. They don't have another innovation there because it wasn't grounded in maybe a holistic understanding of what's needed. So that's certainly that is certainly a risk. Yes.
Interesting. Well, Nate, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find you, find New Founding, keep up with all the important work that you guys are doing?
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter, very active on Twitter, Nate Fischer on Twitter. You can go to our website, newfounding.com. And there's a number of ways that we would like to interact with people. I mean, ultimately, we're looking to get to know a wide range of people who are interested in this movement. I think it's something, I think the fact that there's a positive vision as part of it can actually be of interest to the broader movement. And I'll add sort of one thing here, particularly related to a lot of people in the new right in politics, is I think pursuing this positive vision, developing some of these ideas through something like venture offers a bridge even between old right people who are nervous about departure from markets and new right people who know that we need a positive vision and they're not content to just sort of settle for old platitudes. So I think there's actually, I don't even know exactly how this plays out in DC, but I think there's opportunities for partnerships to develop something that we all see as needed, which is this positive vision. So I'm interested in those conversations, sort of wide ranging for people across politics. Biggest way to get involved right now, we're a venture firm. If you have a startup, come to us. We want to hear from you, especially if there's a political element to it, if you're reaching people on the right through the market. We want to hear from you. As investors, we launched our fund. It's on AngelList. You can find the website. You can find it on our website, newfounding.com. You can find the page talking about that. Tremendous opportunity in this space. It's early innings of something that I think is growing very large. So there's opportunity to invest for accredited investors to invest in it. For other partners in business, we have a talent network. We get people often out of woke companies into non-woke companies and increasingly into sort of exciting startups that are actually building this future that let you go day to day to work and build the America you want to live in. So if you go there, you can sign up for our talent network. You can get involved. It's something where it's a growing network of people, and increasingly there's a growing network of companies that are looking for talented and ambitious people. So again, website has a lot of this. It's startups, it's capital investment, it's talent if you're a company that's hiring, and then very active on Twitter.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us again this week for another fantastic episode of Moment of Truth. Thank you to Nate for being so charitable with his time. And finally, we were able to make everything work to get him here in the chair to record. Make sure you go check out New Founding and check out everything that Nate's working on. It's all really cool stuff that I don't have the aptitude to do, so I'm very glad somebody is doing it. Make sure you go to our website, americanmoment.org, to find out more about all the programs that we host, the things that we believe, why we do what we do, etc. You can also check out americanmoment.org/donate if you are so inclined. Please rate and review this podcast, 5 stars only, please. We also prefer a written review. If you give I actually haven't checked this in a while, but let me pull it up here. If you give a written review, I would be more than happy to read your comments on the air. I'm just checking to see if there are any. I don't see any new ones. So if you go and do that, I will pull those up next time, or I'll make sure that Sarab does it, and we will make sure to read it on air. Thank you very much for joining us again, and we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to americanmoment.org to learn more.